Canada has been awakened as the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was submitted.
Perhaps the most burning topic with regards to Indigenous affairs is the concept of reconciliation. As defined by Merriam-Webster, reconciliation is the act of causing two people or groups to become friendly again after an argument or disagreement. In this case, the two groups being First Nations and the Government of Canada. What stands as one of the largest and most documented factors of reconciliation for Canadian First Nations is the need to overcome Canada's dark past with its residential schooling system. Schools where Indigenous children were forced to conform, were abused, and died. In 2008, the Canadian government launched a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with government-appointed members in an effort to confront the long-lasting and devastating impact residential schools had. The TRC, for short, gathered testimonies from thousands of witnesses, some 6,500 victims abused by the schooling system. Its purpose? To bring these harsh realities and torturous histories to light, and to make a call for action in two key forms: apologies and the urgency to reform several ways in which the government still treated or treats Indigenous people. According to the government website, the Government of Canada will work closely with provinces, territories, First Nations, the Métis Nation, Inuit groups, and church entities to implement recommendations for the TRC and further reconciliation to the benefit of all Canadians. This in order to bring Indigenous issues to light to those non-Indigenous, highly preferred through a new area of education in the public schooling system. But the TRC actually closed its doors in 2015, as other reconciliation groups took the lead, such as the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and Reconciliation Canada. The very important difference here is that these new organizations were and are completely Indigenous-led, fronted by chiefs and elders, much unlike the TRC. Its calls for truth about residential schools did not seem to go far enough, nor did it seem to shed enough light on the abuse acted out on Indigenous children. But just what was the residential school system, and why was it so bad?
South of Hudson's Bay, James Bay, and at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory. News Magazine salutes Education Week with films of an Indian residential school 500 miles north of Toronto.
The propaganda videos distributed by the Canadian government show a rosy picture. Children eating well, clothed sharply, enjoying fun sports and taking an eager learning initiative inside the classroom. A welcoming home, ready to transition your child into a white man's world. But what truly rested amidst the brick walls was far more shocking. Issues faced by the young children attending include an estimated over 6,000 children had deaths connected to the system. Their bodies were not returned to their parents. They suffered poor treatment, neglect, abuse, both physical and sexual, starvation, and more. Families were forced apart and given little to no contact. The children were given new names, forced to learn a new culture and language, forced to completely overturn identity and heritage, and the school even arranged marriages between students. Schools were largely run by church organizations and missionaries, not Indigenous leaders. All this enforced by ministers, Indian agents, and the police.
It was very quiet. It was very hush-hush. And they didn't tell you everything. Sometimes they made up excuses. Sometimes they'd say, well, he was sick and they had to take him away in an ambulance, or she was sick and they had to take her away in the ambulance, and they never told you what happened. And it was only years after that some of us discovered that some of our friends had passed away.
My mom, her goal of having me graduate, what she didn't even understand in the early years, as to graduate. She was sitting right there on my day of graduation. All the abuses I've suffered, everything that's happened through my life, do not compare to what I experienced that day.
I guess it's just that family connection and just not having some kind of memory at times. And it always goes back to being robotic. No feeling, no emotions, no nothing. If you got hurt, no one was there to comfort you.
She used to throw chalk and that brushes at us. But she would get really upset that when she threw that brush, I used to catch it. And she used to get really mad. And one day she turned my ear and I could hear my ear cracking. We ran away. I went down the hill and all of a sudden that green station wagon pulled out behind us. And I knew who that was. That was the administrator. And of course they took us all the way back. And that night, in front of everybody, they take our clothes off and he strapped us really hard too. And I don't know how he made out, but I got an injury from that. And it's an injury that I still carry today.
The social worker from Vernon, she threatened my dad with jail. They cut off all our hair short, you know, and then they threw away all our clothes and give us different clothes with numbers on it next morning early. And then I was told my dad got killed by a hit and run. Yeah.
Did you ever see that electric chair?
Yep. I sat on it one time. Yeah. It was a steel chair with a battery in the bottom, I think, and wires, and then you had to hang on to the bars here, and then you had to crank up the power.
Nurturing relationships between parents and children were severed. Residential schools were a frontal attack on parenthood.
When the principal used to beat up the other children, like boys, the boys got the most beating. They used to call it bench party, and it was usually done after supper. And that's where I got frightened, because I saw blood.
I remember when we had to shower. You only have to show me how to shower and clean and wash myself, how to wash my private and my, private parts of your body. You only have to show a kid once or twice at the most, but not every day. And have the supervisor come in there and basically take advantage of you.
A great example of cultural genocide, the often forceful loss of value or nulling of a culture by one who has themselves deemed greater than it. In the case of residential schools, they were white established institutions which sought to better prep Aboriginal children for integration into a white Christian society, not their own. The last residential school closed in 1991 after years of allegations. Calls for repeal were made to the Indian Act, leading to closures through the latter half of the 20th century. As the final schools closed in the 1990s, victims began to make public statements of neglect. Starting around the mid-1980s, in fact, some churches had begun to offer apologies for their destruction of indigenous cultures. Then Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized in 2008, but the government did not compensate survivors in Newfoundland, as they were not part of Canada at the time. However, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized again in 2017, inclusive of Newfoundland, offering a multi-million-dollar settlement. In recognizing and understanding the hardships imposed on Indigenous peoples, the Canadian government can better situate itself in both its apologies and its aid in rebuilding Indigenous culture. The TRC focused itself on residential schools, something which the government ignored even years after the last one closed in the 1990s. The Canadian government, in our case particularly through residential schooling, has made great efforts in killing Aboriginal cultures, and much smaller efforts in rehabilitating it, which makes any form of future friendship unfeasible if things continue in this way. Indigenous leaders, after all, have had to take it upon themselves to go about their own rehabilitation. Any wonder, then, why the TRC soon closed thereafter? Nothing evolved. What problems arrive when one of the largest and initial reconciliation groups was led by the government, and by government-appointed leaders? What bias arises here? Why did Aboriginal peoples create so many reconciliation groups of their own a few years later, before the TRC even closed?